Hey team, I wanted to take you through chapter 6, which has to do with collective and group violence. Um, we're going to cover many different kinds of collective and group violence in this PowerPoint. I am not going to go through all 59 slides, but I'm going to pull out some of the things that I think are most important for you to know. And so let's go ahead and get started. Let me get this onto the slideshow. It's important to recognize that there are two different types of collective violence. There's collective violence that is intentional. That is, groups get together, they have the same values, same mindset, and they are intent on causing harm and violence and destruction. There are other groups um, that also hold the same values and beliefs, and they don't necessarily set out to commit violent acts or to cause harm or to cause destruction. So I want to go through those a little bit with you so that you can understand the differences in the two different types of groups. Um, so crowds, we've all been in crowds. If you've ever been to Disney World, you're in a crowd. Uh, those people definitely have the same beliefs, same values, but they're not necessarily intent on causing harm or violence or destruction. So crowds can be violent, but they also can be very peaceful. Mobs are the same way. Uh, if you think back to the founding of our country, there were lots of protests, lots of mobs, and even though at times they engaged in violent behaviors and harmed others, that may not have been their intent. It may have been their intent simply to convey a message. Riots. Riots are a little bit different in our modern history. Riots have been inherently violent. Um, they cause violence to other people, they cause destruction to property, and while they, again, hold the same values and beliefs, there's usually an intent there that they're going to go out and cause harm. Panics kind of falls between mobs and riots in that you have a group of people who, oh, quite frankly, are scared or they have a message that they want to convey. There are times when those particular individuals become violent, but it's not necessarily their intent to be violent. Um, Social movements are a different class. Typically, with a social movement, with few exceptions, there's not an intention to cause violence. So, uh, probably the most famous example would be Martin Luther King Jr. He was the leader of a reform movement, and one of the core tenets of that movement was nonviolence. They didn't cause property destruction. They didn't hurt other people, although they themselves were hurt. That is in contrast to revolutionary movements and reactionary social movements. These have the potential to cause violence, cause mayhem, to destroy property. It really depends. Sometimes they can peacefully um, get their message of revolution across or reaction to a particular issue. So, a recent example of a reactionary social movement would be the marches on Washington that have to do with protecting the environment. Again, very peaceful, but they were reactionary. They were reacting to policies that roll back some of the protections of our environment. Gang violence is really something on its own. Uh, I can't think of a gang that necessarily operates without violence, without harm, without destruction. Um, Gang members tend to be minorities, they tend to be young, they tend to have very few family ties, and they find comfort and a sense of kinship with their fellow gang members. Um, the book breaks down three different types of gangs: street gangs, prison gangs, and outlaw motorcycle gangs. The latter, the outlaw motorcycle gangs, some people take exception to this. They're called biker clubs. And there are some biker clubs that are nonviolent. They simply have a core set of beliefs, a core set of values, and there are outlaw motorcycle gangs. There's actually a very prominent one here in Colorado. The other two, I think we can agree that these are most definitely violent entities. Street gangs control certain aspects of illegal activities, drugs, prostitution, guns, so on and so forth. Prison gangs uh, tend to control what happens inside prison. This includes getting drugs into prison. This includes disciplinary actions within prisons. There's quite a bit of violence that occurs between different prison gangs. So definitely violence is a core characteristics of those two. Um, as you've read in your books, gangs account for probably more homicides than any other group. And other gang related violence, sexual assaults are very common, gun violence is very common. Um, some of these can be quite brutal. Um, if you want to read more into, say, Mexican mafia type gangs, then you can see some of the behaviors or actions that they take against rival gang members. The future of gangs, I think until we address some of the social issues that give rise to gangs, that is, lack of family, lack of direction, um, a sense of responsibility to social order, we're going to continue to see these kinds of gangs emerge. Organized crime and violence. Organized crime is usually separated into a distinct group as opposed to gang violence. Although in this country, organized crime has been really on the decline in certain areas. So what you typically think of as the mafia um, holds less power than some of the other organizations. For example, human trafficking has become one of the major types of organized crime in this country, um, dealing with counterfeit money, drugs, um, individuals. Child pornography is a huge transnational organized crime circuit, and we know that these are circuits because we've done studies and we can see where these groups move across the country and even across nations to engage in their criminal activities. Um, Controlling transnational crime is very, very difficult. Uh, it takes special task force. There are obviously extradition issues, and it's not necessarily possible to control all of it. Although within the United States, we can address some of the crime or the organized crime that's coming across our borders. So in this chapter, they're really going to cover certain types of or forms of violence that occur within groups or collectives. Now, this is not an individual, these are groups of people, typically, again, who have the same value system, the same mindset, and the same goals and objectives. Uh, Typically, when I teach organized crime, I say the number one thing that either gangs or organized criminals or what have you, their main objective is to get money. They typically fail in traditional society to get what they believe that they deserve, so they engage in these criminal activities with like-minded individuals to increase their wealth and status. So they're characteristically non-institutional in nature. That means that they are sort of subculture. They don't necessarily adhere to the same values and belief systems that ordinary citizens do. Um, there's a great range of collective and group violence, from organized crowds to mobs to panics. A panic is something that is generally quite unorganized, to very sophisticated networks. If you've ever read a study about fencing, fencing is when someone receives stolen goods and then sells it. There's a famous study about fencing. I believe it was done by Decker, And you would be so shocked at how organized that particular network is. I mean, this is across the country. It's very tight. That is, they don't let people in, and it works very, very well. Terrorism is something that sometimes people refer to it as collective or group violence, and sometimes it's its own unique type of violent crime. So for now, we're gonna shelve that discussion and we're gonna move on. So theories of collective violence, I'm gonna let you read through this. For the most part, what we see in the literature primarily is strain theory, and that has to do with people who essentially want something, either money or status or power, and they're not able to achieve that in traditional ways. And so they engage in subcultures or violent activities or subversive activities to get what it is that they want. There is also the social learning theory, birds of a feather, that sort of argument, and that you can get with a group of people and not necessarily be brainwashed, but you want to be a part of something bigger, and so you become a member of this violent group or collective. So I'm going to let you read through the rest of it. That's the walkthrough for Chapter 6. If you have any questions, please let me know and we will walk through it. Thanks for listening. Have a good night.